Welcome to the fourth in our series of Outback Conversations. Today we'll be discussing conservation during recovery with Dr. Barry Traill from the Pew Charitable Trusts and Jimmy Cocking from Arid Lands Environment Centre.
All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the fourth in our series on Outback Australia and the impact of COVID-19. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all separately meeting today. In my case, that's the Jinnaburra people, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. My name's Edwina. I work for the Pew Charitable Trusts in Queensland, and today's topic is one I'm particularly excited about. We'll be talking about the conservation and management of outback landscapes and how COVID-19 has changed things for better or worse. Our first speaker today is Dr. Barry Traill, who is Director of the Pew Charitable Trust's Outback to Oceans program. Barry is a very strong advocate for the need for more people to be on country in order for the landscape to be conserved and managed. We're also joined by Jimmy Cocking, Director of Arid Lands Environment Centre. Jimmy is particularly interested in issues around creating a sustainable future across Outback Australia. Before we start, I'll just go over the format of these sessions for anyone joining us for the first time. Barry will talk first, followed by Jimmy, and then we'll throw over to questions at the end. Our sessions have been running over the half-hour mark. If you have to drop off on the dot of 30 minutes, we won't take it personally, but please stick around longer if you can. Like the other sessions to date, this one will be posted on the Outback Alliance website soon, so you can come back and review the content down the track or share it with others who can't make it. You can please post questions into the chat box and make sure you're addressing them to all panelists and attendees so everyone can join in the conversation, but you can also send questions directly to me via the Q&A function down the bottom of your screen. And if you want to take a minute to introduce yourself and where you're from in the chat box so we can all see who's here with us today, that would be great. All right, without further ado, I will pass over to you, Barry.
Thanks, Edwina. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to acknowledge Jinnaburra people, the country I'm on in the Sunshine Coast hinterland, and indeed all the traditional owners whose country we're talking about today in remote Australia. And if I could, all the land managers who do the hard yards looking after remote Australia. What I'd like to do first is discuss, I think, the basics of the country we're talking about environmentally. And it can be easy to overlook as Australians, as that we have one of the very few remaining intact big natural spaces left on Earth, along with the Amazon, Antarctica, the Great Boreal Forest of Canada. The Outback's an unusual place in what's now a planet that's very crowded with people, in that it is still quite intact. The rivers still flow as they always do, wildlife still moves as it always has. It covers an enormous reach of Australia. So just quickly show here on my shared screen. Around 75% of the continent has around 3% of the people. And that's very unusual globally. We have some of the most sparsely populated country on Earth. And of course, in an industrialized world, that means that nature is still, much of nature's in good shape. But there's a problem which is often not understood, is that much of the outback, the problem is not too many people taking up too many resources, which it is in much of the world now. It's actually a lack of people, or to be more specific, a lack of land managers looking after the country. Because it's very clear now, traditional knowledge has always told us, and Western science has, absolutely confirmed that if you don't have people on country managing it, it becomes unhealthy. Species like the flock pigeons behind me will decline and disappear because of uncontrolled wildfires and the effects of a whole range of introduced invasive noxious plants and animals. So we absolutely need to support people and look after people who are managing the country. That's an absolute standout. And most of the outback, in fact, has fewer people on it managing it than at any time in the last 50 or 60,000 years. So a lot of what we do at Pew Charitable Trusts, I know the work that Jimmy Cocking does at Arid Lands Environment Centre is supporting people to be on the country. So I just wanted to emphasise those basics. In terms of the virus, the coronavirus and its impacts, it has been different in the outback because of the isolation, because of the different population, because of the different way the populations are in place. Probably the most immediate thing is the health impacts were averted in large part because of isolation, but also because of the excellent government responses, state and federally, in making sure that the virus largely didn't spread out of the settled cities. But of course, there were great personal disruptions and ongoing economic disruptions. And that's still working through. We're still getting a feel as conservationists, as environmentalists, what the short, medium and long-term impacts of that will be. I'll just flag a few things. I know Jimmy's going to go into a bit more detail, but a few things that would stand out for me. One is that, of course, there was immediate disruption on land management in many cases, work that required group effort or perhaps the import of specialist people moving around the country, such as helicopter pilots to help with aerial fire work, putting in control burns. That was very disrupted. So a lot of the burning season, particularly in Northern Australia, was truncated or done patchily this year. Though in a couple of cases, some notable cases, some very hard-working Indigenous rangers and national park rangers and others went into isolation in small groups for months to do the firework required so that they didn't break quarantine lines. Tourism has been heavily affected, will be heavily affected ongoing for some time. And that's broadly hits the whole economy of many parts of the outback. And it can individually affect the income of land managers, such as station owners who rely partly on tourism. Some Indigenous operations rely partly on tourism funding. So that's going to be very impactful. And it's a bit hard to see quite how that will flow out at the moment. There'll probably be an increase in domestic tourism and of course, once quarantine lifts, but also a decrease in international tourism because those quarantine lines internationally are still in place for the foreseeable future. One very positive thing, one potentially very positive thing is that some of the states and the federal government are considering putting in stimulus packages specifically around conservation and land management. That's dollars to do necessary good work on the ground to keep people in jobs and to keep the economy moving. A couple of things that have been strongly floated in Northern Territory is a gamba grass army. Gamba grass is a noxious African weed which threatens all the northern savannas, and it proposed is an army, hundreds of people on the ground doing what's needed to eradicate and control gamba grass, and a waterhole army further south. Waterholes are a key part of the Arizona course where life congregates, and putting in teams of people to make sure they're clean, invasive animals are kept out of them, and so on. So there's obviously been some negatives. There's potentially some upside. Of course, the key thing to emphasise, and I know it's very much in Jimmy's mind as well, and anyone who works in remote Australia, is the key thing is that government policies need to be purpose-built for the remote space. Because of the sparse social capital, small communities don't operate socially, economically, in terms of contract work, delivery. It operates very differently to the more settled country, the cities, major towns. We've got a whole range of more specialist operators. So things like, which seem to just make intuitive sense of always having competitive contracts. But when you're talking about a space like Western Queensland or Northern South Australia or the Western Deserts, competitive contracts are just a bit of a nonsense. There may or may not be one operation there who can do that job. So the question is, can you connect with those Indigenous rangers or that natural resource management group to get the job done? You've got to work with the people who want to live in the space. Thanks, Edwina.
Thank you, Barry. I've got a couple of questions here for you, and a couple have come in from me, but I will save them for the end and pass over to Jimmy to speak now.
Yeah, thanks, Edwina, and thanks, Barry. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the Central Aranda traditional owners and the custodians of Barry Springs, where I am today, and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also want to extend that respect to anyone else who's of First Nations or Aboriginal heritage, or people who are here on this call, and recognise also that their sovereignties on these lands has never truly been ceded. The Arid Lands Environment Centre, we're Central Australia's own environmental organisation. It was established in 1980 to advocate for the protection of nature in the desert country. Our vision for healthy futures for arid lands and people. Firstly, I also want to just thank the Outback Alliance and Dana, Amber and Edwina for making this series happen. It's been great to be able to tune in. As Barry said, there are lots of opportunities for conservation, and stimulus is going to play a role in that. But it's also important that we look beyond the animals, the plants and the habitats, and making sure, as Barry said, that we're supporting the people and supporting the systems that support the health of the ecosystems. One of the biggest threats to the outback, we always hear that weeds, ferals and wildfire are the key threats, but these are impacts that have come over the decades and the centuries of changing of the landscape through colonialism and the damage that has come from that. What's happening now is the risk of the cultural connections that have maintained the landscapes, the song lines, the ceremonies, the proper burning, and the passing on of intergenerational knowledge through those processes. And that's been going on for thousands of years. And there are some great projects like the 10 Deserts project that both Alec and Pew are involved in. We're conservation partners in that project. And that's doing some great work in bringing rangers together on country, getting more fire in the landscape, coordinating buffel grass, which is they call it the cane toad of the grasses, or it's the desert gamba grass, which is a landscape transformer. But also making sure that cultural and ecological knowledge programs are happening, camels are being managed, and supporting people to get on country to do conservation. But like everything in this entire world, much has changed with COVID. The lockdowns and the inability of people in town to get out to communities has impacted on work plans for rangers, but it's also highlighted the vulnerability of communities. So currently there's a parliamentary inquiry into food security in bush communities, and that was a supply issue. It wasn't just about affordability of food. It was actually that there wasn't enough food getting out to the shops. And these problems would have been actually made much worse had things like the JobKeeper payment and others not been increased to stimulate the economy and give people the opportunity to move beyond that. So bush communities are last on the long line of the transport of food, and toilet paper trucks coming out from major centres and cities. And so those shortages in the cities meant out here for days and weeks people went without. And we need to make sure, if we're going to be advocating and working to support people to stay on country and maintain those cultural links and do the work that's needed to look after the country, more needs to be done to support sustainable systems, and that food is one part of that. Also, climate justice has become a big issue out here, where inappropriate housing, overcrowding, lack of supporting water and energy infrastructure has left communities vulnerable. Climate change is actually the biggest threat to conservation in the outback. There's this time of year, people are struggling to stay affordably warm in winter, but in summer there's no escape from the heat. And out here the heat can kill, and apparently that's not even recorded or considered as a cause of death. So climates are going to be a big issue for conservation out here, and we need to make sure that we match those efforts of keeping people and supporting people to stay on country, that's matched with supporting livability out here. So with Alec, a lot of the work that we are doing on varying degrees and scales is looking around the food, water, energy security, and also look to see how we can support jobs. And these all need to be considered in the context of a warming world. There's preparing for the impacts of climate change, protecting our groundwater, reducing emissions through supporting proper burning practices, but also making sure that we've got climate adaptive building, energy efficient housing and retrofits to make sure that there's some jobs that can be created in that situation, but also participatory planning processes where people sit down in the dirt with people on community and actually work through what they need to be able to live sustainably in the communities. There's also opportunities to sequester carbon. That's through burning, probably more in the other northern parts where there's a bit more rain, but also there are studies that are looking at how that can happen here. But solar and renewable energy needs to be a big part of how we support conservation efforts on across the outback. And we need to, and I suppose, part of the conversation I want to start today and is continuing on, other people are having it, is we need to be looking at livelihoods and sustaining people's life out here to make sure that conservation and nature protection happens. As far as COVID recovery goes, a lot of what we've heard recently around recovery there's been a focus on gas as a means to rebuild the economy. And that's been a concern for us and a concern for others in the conservation movement because of the increasing emissions, the spreading of weeds, the risks to groundwater, disrupting a connectivity and the economic and social costs that has on the communities. And so, as we all know, we don't have to do exploration for the sun. The sun's been rising in the east and falling in the west for time immemorial, and we need to actually look to see how we can view, rather than a deficit model of what the outback may be, we need to look at the opportunities, and the outback could be a source for a renewable energy superpower. There's conversations happening in the Northern Territory around that to see how renewable energy can support communities, but also be able to reduce emissions, which in turn enables us to protect the country. One of the key things that needs to happen as well is ensuring that communities' housing is built to withstand the heat, the 45 to 50 degrees that we're going to be experiencing here under climate scenarios. And because if the communities can't support people, people will move into towns and not be able to be where they need to be, which keeps them healthy, happy, and so we need to be focusing on how we can support people to stay out here on their country, rather than looking to see how we can always recruit new people up. Because if it gets hotter, it gets harder. We're going to need to focus on. I can see the time's getting away, so I better keep rolling. So what we need to do is focus on the strengths. For COVID recovery, we need to focus on the strengths of the regions and not play on the weaknesses. The landscape, the sun, the wind, the people, and addressing the health needs of people will support healthy country. Addressing housing, energy, and equity issues will protect special and sacred places by enabling people to maintain their connection to it. And we need to focus on virtuous cycles and how we can build virtual cycles out here, rather than simply the vicious cycles that we hear about in the East Coast media. I've talked about bush communities, and I think it's really important with language to talk about bush communities. A traditional owner here at a summit in March described the importance for us to say bush communities, because people aren't remote from their country. They're remote from us, and they're remote from many people in urban centres, but they are right in the middle of where they're supposed to be. So looking to see how we can shift the language and shift our thinking when it comes to the outback. The outback, in my mind, it's the heart of the country. It is resilient, but when policies and decisions are being made by people remote to the intended audience, without thought for how connected things are out here, and without a view on the impacts on people or a willingness to listen, nature degrades and the lives and legacies are lost. So COVID's woken up a lot of people, I think, to these vulnerabilities, like recent heat waves have over summer, to the impacts of climate. So I guess, no longer can we close our eyes and ears to the outback. It's time to listen. It's time to learn. Nature's taught us over millennia to listen to the signs. And the sign is, if you look after country, it looks after you. So hopefully when the borders open and tourism and movement starts happening again, people will take the time to listen when they come out here, and will take the time to learn and realise that it is actually really different out here. And that requires policymakers to treat it differently, think differently, and act accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. I have a bunch of questions that have come in. Jimmy, while I've got you there, I'll just throw one over to you. You both have touched on, obviously, the fact that there's a much sort of smaller amount of voices in the outback. Are there ways we could better be amplifying those voices so that they're heard at a federal level by decision makers more consistently?
I think you know, the thinking behind the Outback Alliance is part of that story. I think that being able to have people located in capital cities that have direct links and lines to people who are living out here to be able to express what people's needs are is going to be really critical. I think groups how Pew, sorry,
I might pick up from
go for it.
Yeah, just to play on from that, from what Jimmy said, there's a fundamental thing, and some language that I picked up from someone else. The Outback's always got a democracy deficit. It's got 75% of the land, 3% of the people, and use the usual mechanism when there's a problem that needs to be sorting or allocation of resources. It's dealt with through democratic processes quite reasonably. We will always have a deficit of that in the Outback. There is no way around that. And so we have to collectively go that extra hard yard to get it understood that of what's needed in remote spaces. And that doesn't always, you know, people always think, I just want more money. Often it's very simple things. Often it can be less money delivered better because understandably governments, when they're focusing on getting out health or education, it might be a stop smoking program, it could be dealing with environment issues. They'll focus on where the people are. And the mechanism to get it out in the something in the western suburbs of Sydney is not what's going to work in Western Queensland or the bush communities around Alice. And it doesn't necessarily require a massive amount of thinking, but it requires some thinking, not to just roll it out as one size fits all.
Okay, I've got another question here about, I think we talked a little bit about climate change and the fact it's going to make it more challenging for people, you know, to actually live and work across Outback Australia. But do you see climate change as sort of reducing or, I guess, increasing the need for that kind of active land management in Outback places? Barry, I might throw that one to you first and then over to Jimmy.
Yeah. First of all, it's part of the solution. The better we manage land, the more carbon will be stored in the landscape, such as behind Jimmy and behind me at the moment. And that's already started. Graziers, Indigenous groups are already doing active carbon farming and getting money for it. So it's definitely a virtuous circle there of carbon dollars, more healthy environments. That's happening. Yeah, and I'll pass to you, Jimmy, to go from there.
Yeah, I think that there are, and particularly in the Northern Territory too, there are some examples coming through around offset policies and looking at seeing how to support land management to deal with threats to biodiversity, whether it's dealing with buffel grass or gamba grass and protecting threatened species. But a lot of that work, I suppose, that's just making sure that climate change is thought about in the context, because ultimately there's long time cycles, particularly out in the desert, where the burning cycles should be, you know, no less than 10 years normally. But what we're seeing with the impact of weeds and buffel grass, which under climate change scenarios are set to spread, is that burning can happen every 1, 2, 3 years, depending on rainfall. So active management enables the country to be able to respond to draw more carbon out, but also to increase that resilience, which then increases the resilience of the communities. So that's, I suppose, getting back to there's income opportunities, but also making sure that pastoral land sector and other land management sectors are able to access those benefits too, which means not just having just straight full pastoral lease, but looking at ways of which to do some conservation and active management for carbon and biodiversity within a pastoral lease, rather than, you know, locking it up in national parks. Land needs to be actively managed.
Okay, there's another question that's come in here about, we've talked, I guess, a bit about the sort of employment opportunities that have sort of come out of COVID, or not opportunities, but how we need to be, kind of focusing on creating jobs, on the back of COVID. Are there any other opportunities that might have come out of this sort of period of time for conservation or land management in the outback that we should be sort of focusing on or looking to kind of continue with?
You go, Jimmy.
Well, the answer is yes. I think it's still early days. Like, I think, ultimately we had the biosecurity zones, and where the people have only just been allowed back into town for the last 20 days now. So there was about 2 months at least where people were unable to come into town. So I think there's still working that through, but there are definitely, I think, some of the opportunities, particularly, and it's not so much directed to land management, but the connections of people. And I think, Zoom and these sorts of ways of communicating has helped people stay connected across the desert. I know through the 10 Deserts project, has been these sorts of forums have been a way to keep people connected and sharing knowledge and staying motivated and feeling part of something bigger, because I think that's something that is really critical with this work, is that it can be pretty isolating if you're a ranger coordinator out in community, particularly with the biosecurity zones that are going on, and to be able to know that there are other people out there that know what they're up to and support their work to be able to keep going, I think is critical. Barry, have you got it?
No, nothing particularly to add to that. I think it's certainly just going on in terms of communication. I think there's been it's been obviously commentated on a lot in terms of people working from home, work, etc. Is that standardising communication, such as we're doing now, will, I think, make a material difference in lots of positive ways.
All right, I've got a question here. I'll probably throw over to you, I think, first, Jimmy. You've talked a bit about the links, I guess, and in fact, both of you have, between conservation and all the social, human and infrastructure sort of issues and benefits, how it all, I guess, sort of ties together, and how, addressing conservation into the future is going to mean addressing all of these other issues as well. How do you think we could get the investment to kind of support, what you outlined, Jimmy? Is it something we should be calling on, the federal government? Is it a state thing? Do we need to be looking to the private sector to invest? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a combination of all three. I think we always have that conversation when we're talking to mining companies who are wanting to do their social impact assessment as part of their EIS processes, that they need to be part of the community. It's not good enough to just come and sponsor a footy club, put a logo on a footy jumper and pay for the footy jumpers and some oranges for a year. They've actually got to invest in stuff in infrastructure that the community needs. And I think that's part of the work where, the private sector, led by government, but also making sure that the community is at the centre of it, because the communities need to be part of that planning process to sit down and understand the risks and impacts of climate change and these sort of longer term, the future is going to be different to the past. But also making sure that those processes are supported by governments of various levels, because ultimately the only way that we're going to be able to navigate through these challenges is going to be all levels of, there's got to be a process for all levels of government and the private sector working in a way to complement each other's work, as opposed to duplicating or working at odds with each other, which can sometimes happen too. So better planning process is going to be critical, and that's also going to create more certainty for those that are putting the money up, and also more certainty for the community.
And I think there's to go on from that, if I could, Edwina, there's often there's sometimes a space that comes out as the assumption is a remote Australia. I'm not just talking about Indigenous remote Australia, white communities as well. Somehow they're being subsidised, and really shouldn't everyone just be rational and sort of come into the towns and the cities? And I think that's I frankly just find it's a weird, nonsensical space, because if you follow that logic, you'd probably cut off Tasmania, because, are we subsidising Tasmania or the whole of the Northern Territory? I mean, it gets down to this sort of weird thing, or maybe the only thing you'd have left is somehow Sydney, but even in parts of Sydney, you could argue being subsidised. I don't think it's a useful space at all. We have a continent. It's an extraordinary continent. We're all Australians. We all reasonably expect, and reasonable levels of health, housing, education, environmental protection. The question is how we deliver that, and that's going to be, as Jimmy said, it's a mix of government services and private sector engagement. And I think that the devil is in the detail. And I think what we're saying is not more resources, is just let's deliver the resources better that are already going there.
Thank you. Look, there's just a couple of more questions here, and then we're a little bit over time, so we'll probably wrap up after those, unless anyone else has any more they want to send through quickly. So I've had a question here, like, where are the good news stories now? Is there anyone out there we can look to who's already doing this, doing what we're talking about here well? Are there any sort of either local areas, state governments, the federal government, are there any policies that we should be looking to emulate more broadly that could help us to sort of put in place some of what we've talked about today? Jimmy, I might pass that one over to you first.
Right. Thank you. Well, I guess in the territory there is some good news stories coming out, at least on paper. Some of the local decision-making framework and other a lot of work around Environment Protection Act, and a lot more of an integrated approach to conservation is good. I suppose like with anything, it's the implementation and the details about how that translates does cause issues. So the intent there is there, but in practice it's not so much. I think some of the good news stories are actually coming out of particularly in the deserts. Is the 10 Desert story is a great story that's coming out, which is generating support for anybody. It's worth checking out the 1010deserts.org website and have a look at that. It's an Indigenous-led conservation project across the 10 deserts of Australia. There's some good news stories coming out of that, and I think that, well, at the time when it got launched, and I still think there is a lot of government interest in terms of that program, which was funded by BHP Foundation, which is wouldn't have happened. A government wouldn't have funded a conservation project to that degree, and as a result of that investment by the foundation, it is creating opportunities for government to actually step in and look at ways in which they can add value to it and increase it. So I think that there's opportunities there. I think that, but yeah, it's hard at the moment. I think that governments, particularly out here in the outback, don't necessarily get it. There's obviously a lot of room for improvement, but there are some lights on the horizon.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything to that, Barry?
Yeah, I think there's the big one. Two big ones I point to is the whole Indigenous land management sector, as now a very large and significant sector, more than 3,000 Indigenous rangers, and it's still a story that's been better known, and it has its struggles doing hard work in remote spaces with communities which are obviously sometimes struggling with social issues. But it's taken off. It is extraordinary. It is globally leading. There are vast areas of country now being better managed because of it, and that's come from a whole range of grassroots work backed up by governments, backed up by the private sector, philanthropy, and also natural resource management. I think there's some great projects being done by NRM groups, natural resource management groups. One that stands out in my mind, I've just had more to do with it as a Queenslander, is steadily reducing a terrible noxious weed, prickly acacia, on the Mitchell grass plains of central Western Queensland. It's a weed that destroys productivity for cattle, destroys wildlife habitat, and the Desert Channel's NRM group has just done a great job with Southern Gulf and others of just really chipping away, just pushing, working with landholders. So it's those coordinated stories. They're often stories that are just not well known in the city, and that goes back to, I think, our job collectively is to help with the democracy deficit. How do we bring those stories and make it real, exciting and valued with decision makers in the public in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide?
All right, look, I've got one question left here. It seems increasingly like Australians won't be going overseas anytime soon. Do you think that sort of provides us, I guess, a bit of a window of opportunity now to get people actually out into outback places, people who, you know, from the cities who might not have been there before or might not have spent much time there, and you know, to see the beauty of these places and the natural values for themselves? And if so, do you have any kind of great ideas about how we could do that?
More than happy for lots of tourism to come, as long as people bring their hand sanitizer and socially distanced. I think there is a lot of concern here in the Northern Territory on the ground. I think there's the tourism industry obviously wanted the borders open 6 weeks ago, but there is general concern in the community around the opening up and the risk to the Aboriginal people across the outback because of the vulnerabilities and existing health issues. So I'd say welcome everybody to come, but please take precautions and make sure that they are reducing their potential for bringing anything in, because we do need to ensure that this is doesn't spread here, because we've had no community transmission in the Northern Territory. So let's keep it that way.
Yeah, I just find that obviously we've got to get the health stuff right. Absolutely got to get it right. But assuming that's covered, there will be a tourism boom domestically. People aren't going to go to Bali, and it's a great opportunity. We collectively need to make the most of it. Yeah.
To help people get
Fantastic.
it. Yeah.
Someone Jenny in the comments here has suggested gamba bashing holidays as an option there. So,
or buffalo busting, you can come out. Buffalo busting out to the desert.
It's alliterative as well.
We've got some Maddocks here.
All right, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much for your time today, Jimmy and Barry. That's been really insightful. And as I said earlier, for anyone who missed it, we will be posting this up on the Outback Alliance website. Our next session is Thursday at the same time as today's, and we'll be talking about education. And we'll be joined by Alana Moller from Isolated Children's Parents Association and Michael Little from Desert Knowledge Australia. So please, if you have the time on Thursday afternoon, drop in and join us then. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sabrina. Thanks all. Really appreciate it.